So I'm going to leave it on. If there's something that I want to say that's really important, I'll take it off for a second and put it right back on. Is that okay? Just so that everybody can, I'll repeat the questions with it off and put it right back on. Is that good? Okay. So we are, can everybody hear me online? Can you give me a thumbs up if we're good? Oh, fantastic. Okay. So first of all, again, good Yontif and Shana Tova on 5782. So as I've said, this is what I've always been hoping that we could do, is really have dialogue and create that. And so just a quick overview, and then I really want to hear from you, and we'll have that dialogue to share together. So over the past year, besides living through a pandemic, we've lived through a heightened awareness around systemic racism. We've lived through a rise in anti-Semitism, and we've had to navigate both of those concurrently on top of navigating a global pandemic. So for any rabbi coming into that situation is into a new community is kind of almost like a joke. You know, it's like you can't be serious. But very much we are, and I don't control the world, nor do I ever have that plan to. And I really just want to be a small part in trying to make this world more kinder and more whole. That has always been my hope. That's how my parents raised me. That's how I hope to do the work in the world. And I realize that there may be things that I say that other people don't agree with. And there may be things that are lightning rods, and there may be other issues. And I am always willing to be in that dialogue, in that frame of dialogue. But what I write is what I write, and I stand by my words 100%. I don't ever, if I write it, it's in print, and that means it'll never be taken away. I can amend it, I can send a tshuva, I can do all the things that I want to do. But I also know when I think about standing in front of several thousand people every year, that words matter, and that what I say matters. And so I'm very clear on that. So I just want to come off by saying that very intentionally and very focused, that I really feel that the work we have to do in the world is really important. And the issues that this year we were focused on around anti-Semitism and around what I focused on last night on Kol Nidre, which was about hope, and it was about memory, it was about pride, and it was really about hope. That's really what it was framed in, and I used the literary devices of memory and pride to get us there. So I want to open this up. I want you to ask questions. I want you to challenge. I want it to be in the way of digging deep, as Yom Kippur asks us to, but also just in the way of respect, that we're doing it respectfully, and that if there's a question, that we can raise it as a question, as a challenge, more than as a gut in the, a punch in the gut. I want to be respectful of how everybody receives, and that's even if you're responding to one another. So, who would like to begin? Who would like to share any ideas, thoughts, maybe that was sparked? It doesn't have to be exactly what's tied to the sermon. It can be ideas that come from the sermon. So that's how we did it last year, and that was a very productive session. You're up, go ahead.
On our way home today, my daughter and my wife and I were talking about anti-Semitism.
I'm going to repeat the question for those that are in.
Being a lawyer, I could talk louder.
Okay.
We were talking about anti-Semitism and how it might have affected us in our lifetimes. And my wife asked our daughter, who was raised at Torrey Pines in this community, if she ever, felt the effects, and her answer was no. And then it got around to me, and I said, overtly using the words as you described in your sermon, I've had those. I can't say they were done with animosity, but they were done. But the only thing I actually remember is not being allowed at the LA Tennis Club or Jonathan's Club in my lifetime. Now, I was raised predominantly in a Jewish neighborhood next to a Catholic convent, but I didn't really feel anti-Semitism directed at me and preventing me from participating in society.
So your question, did everybody hear that online? I just want to were you able to hear that? Great. Okay, so you don't have to repeat. That's good. So you're able to get. Did everybody hear that point? So it was more of a statement about
Yes.
the effects. Well, let me bring you back to 48 hours ago. I want to take you back. It wasn't that long ago. It was after the Rosh Hashanah sermon, and it was before Yom Kippur. And on Monday, which is technically supposed to be my day off, but I don't have a day off, so we'll say Monday is the scheduled day that I don't have appointments. So we started receiving emails from congregants. Not uncommon, happens. The emails have a theme, two themes, two threads. One was the local AFT Guild, which is the American Federation of Teachers, of which some of you may even belong, voted on an anti-Israel resolution. Not only was it anti-Israel, but it also had threads of anti-Semitism and an anti-Semitic rhetoric. If you study Deborah Lipstadt's book, easily identifiable. So that's a little bit of it. And this is happening hyperlocally. The American Federation of Teachers, the national organization, actually had a very similar vote or referendum, thank you, go up in July, that was voted down. And the local guild decided to take it up, and they voted in favor of the resolution. In Burlington, Vermont, also, at the same time, the entire city of Burlington, Vermont was about to vote on an anti-Israel resolution, which also had anti-Semitic rhetoric embedded in it. That luckily never even reached the table, it was tabled. Concurrently with that, the second issue that was brought to me was that my local district, which is the San Diego Union High School District, which one of my children are part of, had their scheduled meeting on Thursday, today, this afternoon at 3 o'clock, and their main topics were critical race theory and masking. So on top of their regular budgetary needs and referendums. So imagine, I came from New York, you know this. So New York, we had off during Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Aside from going to the University of Michigan, this is the first time in my life that I've ever had to deal with navigating children. One goes to the academy, so that's a good thing. But navigating my own child, having to get permission to get them out of school. So on top of a challenging navigating AP courses and high honors classes, navigating all those challenges, we were receiving I was receiving emails from parents and other local leaders saying that this was going on. What are we going to do? Like, when are you going to step in? So I had emailed some of the school board. Within 10 minutes, I received an email back from the I received a phone call from the interim superintendent, explaining the process, explaining that their legal counsel couldn't technically postpone the meeting. I advised her to cancel the meeting. She continued on explaining why they couldn't, but they were going to take the CRTs, critical race theory, and other topics off the table. And she felt very badly about this. I said, I'd like talking points. If you can provide them, I'd like them by the end of the day today, and I'd like to know when a letter is going to go out to the district explaining that you're going to remove these items from the calendar. I did not hear from her by the end of the day, but in fact, the following morning, after I sent her a second email saying, here's your email, she said, I'm a little pushy, she said, we have decided to cancel the meeting. And they canceled the meeting. Small victory in a very heated society. But this is what I meant by this conversation and the topic that I brought up last week. The issue is that we have things that are going on around us each and every day, even if we only feel it at country clubs or may have felt it there. There are actually I'm not even going to go into the honors chemistry teacher exchange I had yesterday with my son's honors chemistry teacher, who basically dismissed my excused absence for my child, but out of religious observance. That's a whole other topic. But these issues are, in fact, enabling. And so when we start to navigate those issues and we're not speaking about them or speaking up about them, then we allow the idea of anti-Semitism to continue to persist in our world. And so it becomes education and awareness of these issues. It doesn't matter the color of our skin, it doesn't matter who we are in the world and how we walk and talk. We know when we learned from Eric Ward last summer, Eric Ward, who is a Black, beautiful man in this world, who stands on fighting and countering racism each and every day of his life, always talks about that racism begins with anti-Semitism. He's the first one who says it. He preaches it every single day. And he is not a Jewish individual at all, but he has studied this, and this is what he preaches each and every day. And the reason I say that, back to the question, which I think is an important, just a statement, is that it is happening in real time, in the middle of the Yomim Noraim, of these 10 days of awe. It is happening right on the ground here, locally in San Diego. And what happened was, the sermon countered and inspired some others in the local guild to start to speak up. It also inspired some others to think critically and to have arguments and conversations in their home about what they haven't been thinking about in a long time. And that's okay. I said it's not pretty. I said it from the beginning. I said it on that day. It is not pretty. It is not something we want to be discussing. I hated writing it. I've never hated writing a sermon more in my entire life as I did that one. I hated it because it was so dark and it was so painful, but it needed to be said. And how it's said, of course, can be nuanced. This was my experience in my take. And so that I just wanted to pepper that. Let's flavor it a little bit with understanding that there are real constructs that are going on, even embedded in our local community, and how we work with it. I know you had your hand up, and then I'm going to come to you. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, this goes back 50 years when I moved to California.
Yes.
Like you, I grew up in New York, and I never confronted anti-Semitism. And I get to this community, and someone is complaining that, they have church music, and all of the graduations were on Friday night. And we through Hadassah, we organized all the principals, because it's an independent school district, and through education. But I see now, I have a granddaughter who is entering Davis this week. And her parents are married under a chuppah by a rabbi, you and I both know. And she has no Jewish education. You say to her, are you Jewish? What are you? I'm Jewish. What does it mean? Nothing. Because she has no Jewish education. She eats apples and honey, and she has Hanukkah. And now her father finally makes the Seder. But that's it. And I am nervous as hell for her going up to Davis without any of this in her gut. And so your sermon, I want a copy of this, because I'll get it. But because your sermon really triggered this in me. And then how do we take this generation that's rejected it, and what do we do about it, even though it's going on?
So it's a great question. I'm going to repeat the question. It was asked to repeat online. The question was, how do we take the current generation of young people, because it's divided among different generations. I want to be very clear. We can say millennial is one generation of several younger generations. We have millennials, Gen Z, Gen Y. We have a lot of generations. Not everybody in the same generation fits the mold, and we see that. So we can have someone who adamantly is really, I'm going to go back. The question was, well, how do we combat it? And I don't know if I have an exact answer to it.
Put this in your ear. I will turn the sound.
I can tell you that.
I unmuted.
I think whoever's online has if you can mute yourself, that would be great. We'd love to hear from you. And I'm going to get, after Susan answers her question, we ask her question, then I will get to some of our online people. We're in a place right now where I believe we have to start younger with education. Those who I've seen work through and transcend these moments have been those who have had a deep understanding of history and identity and memory. And memory is something that is becoming more challenged and compromised, not only because we've been teaching it incorrectly, we have. I really believe. I'm not only talking about Jewish identity. I believe there is a way that we taught, and my generation actually lost that. I'm a Gen Xer. There are a number of you in here that are Gen Xers, right? And we rode the coattails of a safe and secure Israel, beautiful relations with the United States. Our parents being being baby boomers, and being actually being born World War II or post World War II with an understanding of Judaism as an equated right and privilege that you have in American society because we're Americans and you're protected and all is good. Our religious educational settings were boring and they were uninspiring, and it made those students who wanted to continue challenging their own parents who didn't want to pay anymore for them to continue. So therefore, you had a lapse in connection and identity. There was no birthright. We didn't have the idea or concept of birthright. Unless you sought it like I did, to go to Israel and to be involved in Jewish identity, you didn't have that experience. You weren't in it. You didn't have the ability to grow and to learn and to challenge and wrestle with your rabbinic understandings. You didn't. And so we lost that privilege. And we lost it for our children and the generation that came after. And we had to work really hard to reanimate the potential of our connections to Jewish life and Jewish identity. And we made a big mistake. We took an American ideal and rode the coattails of that, thinking that it was sacrosanct and it was a given, and it isn't. Because what we've learned, anything from our tradition, is that you challenge authority, right? If you're in the Israeli, anybody been in the IDF before? Anybody here? Anybody online? Been in the IDF? If you've been in the IDF, you know that if your entire platoon, your kibbutzah, disagrees with the commander, they have the right to override the commander. Right, so, right. This is part of what we are losing and have lost. And we have to make up for that loss. And we have to start younger, educating younger, inspiring younger, bringing people, opening the tents bigger and wider, and not saying this is how it needs to be. The reason we have the way we are doing services now, and the reason we have much more of a national and global impact on our services, is because our lay leadership is very intentional on not closing us down to members only, and sharing what you all have found the gift here, being able to expand that to more people. I can tell you that I get emails from all over the country and world now, from people who are inspired by teachings or sermons or our music, and now feel a deeper connection. So I think I'm feeling excited about the potential. I don't want to run away from the apathy. But right now, our biggest disconnects are between the ages of 13 and 33. That's 20 years. That's a generation. We have an issue. If we're not inspiring our people between the ages of 13 and 33, because when they want to come back and name their children and then have them enroll in religious school for bar and bat mitzvah, all that, then we've done something highly wrong. And like Rabbi Gimel said today, then we are looking for perfection where there is none. And we have to change that model. So there's a lot to do. And we may need you to do that. So I'm holding you to it, Ms. Educator, over there. Susan, go ahead.
Okay. Originally, I was going to respond to your sermon, but Richard's going to do that.
Okay.
So I want to respond to your experience having been new here and having a child in public school. And I'm going to talk to you just like I was talking, as if I saw you personally afterwards.
Sure.
And, you know, I know there's nothing more annoying than to have a new experience, and to have it be very different and very emotional.
Yeah.
And then to have somebody who's been through it year after year after year. But that's who I am. I've been here 51 years. I've had my children in public school, in private secular school. I came here in 1970. Okay. And the only thing I would say is, in my experience, we're a minority population. When I came in 1970, there was almost nothing. I've only found goodwill and interest in learning. There's a lot of things scheduled
Yeah.
or programming that is done out of not thinking about it, not knowing about it, being oblivious, not looking at the calendar, all kinds of these things. And I have found, and I think most people have found, and maybe people will disagree with me, that if the authorities are alerted, or the school or the organization, they really want to accommodate. I mean, and the other thing is, with tests and that, it really doesn't end up affecting any student's education if they miss something here and there, or they miss a sports game. And to me, it always was a way to identify yourself and to say to people, my religion or my observance or my Hebrew school is important to me. And I don't think anybody, and correct me if I'm wrong, has ever been harmed. In fact, they're strengthened. So I just want to say, and I also think that we don't want to conflate or confuse ignorance, obliviousness, mistakes with anti-Semitism, because it's not.
I'm gonna ask for a response before I respond to that, okay? But Susan, I really appreciate, so if you didn't hear in the online, Susan was saying, based on her living here 51 years, that there are certain positives to being unique in certain situations and circumstances. So here that she hasn't experienced setbacks, only movement forward. That's what I heard you say in terms of
It's not New York.
acceptance. No, 100%. And actually, where I was recently living was northern Westchester, and it's still New York area, but it's not the city.
Anyway, not
yes.
to freak out.
No, absolutely not. And I think that I'm going to ask for a response. Any response? Rabbi?
I've given some sermons on anti-Semitism, and I always ended up in the same place. Education. The ADL has been trying education for 100 years and has failed. We failed because, number one, we cannot reach enough people. We just can't. Number two, the people we really need to reach are not in places where the ADL is going to run a program. So I want to suggest something different. Education is great, but it is not it's not the key. I think the key is for every Jew to be an ambassador, because people are changed one person at a time. They're not changed by a room of 500 people. So education, great, I love it. It doesn't work. Second, Rabbi Graubart, this is more of a question than a statement. Rabbi Graubart made a very interesting argument earlier that we have to differentiate between memory and forgetting, and that they are mixed up with each other, and the Amalek thing, remember to forget. And he went through some High Holy Day prayers, some of which were to remember and some of which were to forget. You had the memory and pride walking hand in hand. Great image. He had memory very different, as juxtaposed. I'm wondering how you see the High Holy Days in terms of memory and forgetting our sins.
That's a great question, and I want to I want to answer that, but I want to also respond to Susan. So, did you want to respond to Susan?
Yes,
Okay, go ahead.
I'll make 2 quick points.
Yes.
One, we often like to say, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. I think we should stop coming up for excuses for the people that continuously make the same mistakes over and over and over again. So when it comes to anti-Semitism, we have certain people that continuously make the quote unquote mistake over and over and over again. It gets to a point where it's no longer a mistake. And I think as for why they continue to do the same thing over and over again. The second point, and this I think is more critical, anti-Semitism, I believe, is the only form of hate in the world in which those that are under attack don't get to define it. So anti-Semitism is the one form of hate where non-Jews currently are deciding what it means to be an anti-Semite. How can somebody that's not Jewish define anti-Semitism? I'm not an expert on racism. I'm not an expert on Islamophobia. I'm not an expert on any form of hate. But I'm Jewish, and I know when somebody's attacking me as a Jew. I think it's appalling that those that are not Jewish now think that they define what it means to be anti-Semitic. And when a Jew tells them we don't agree, they disregard what the Jews have to say, and that's a big problem.
I think that was well said. And I would agree that the language that's being set right now around how we even create a definition of anti-Semitism does not rely on us. It relies on those outside of us. So you're bringing up a really important, valid point there. To respond to Susan and then to Rabbi's comment. I know, I see. We're going to you next. This is it. So here we go. Online, you're here just as much as anybody else in the room. So we're here. So Susan, I don't live in, and as you continue to know me over the years, I don't live in fear. I don't operate in that way. I think that there have been, in my year and a half-ish of being on the ground here, even in a global pandemic, I have experienced, and I dealt with swastikas on my son's desk in his school in 7th grade. I've dealt with all these things in New York and happening there too. I've experienced more overt cluelessness around anti-Semitism and inaction and lack of education and awareness than I was surprised. And so I think it's not about building the character of saying we need to do more work. Look, UCSD came in here, all of a sudden Jews are allowed to live in Long Island. It happens, right? Like life happens and life shifts. And I believe that there is evolution, and most of the people that I've run into, at least in leadership, are wonderful, are fantastic. They want to hear, they want to be part of the solutions. We have a lot of allies in that way. We need them to speak up. We need their voices more than we do. We need the allies. We need to build allyship, which I agree with you, Rabbi. I don't know if I agree that education isn't the way. I think it's not the only way. I think it's important, but I believe that allyship has always been a critical piece. So how do we use our spheres of influence to create allyship and partnership and awareness for others? So
I do agree with that. I don't want it to be misunderstood that I don't mean to point out, to correct, to speak out, to say we can't have something on this day.
Yes, I hear you. No, I wanted to just dovetail off that point where I think how we can use the built relationships, like the evolved relationships that we do have, the inspiring ones, and to say how far we've come. Okay, well, we can get further. And it's looking different now, though. It's also, there's a different, if you said to me 3 years ago that the local AFT Guild in San Diego would be putting out a resolution that had to identify anything about any other country besides local policy and law, I would be in shock. I'm not in shock, actually, today that they did that. I'm disappointed with the leadership that did that and where we have to work on that. In terms of answering the High Holy Day piece, how I see it is that I believe it's like I said last night, I'm not negating. Somebody asked me at the end, one of our service leadership people, not the rabbis, but the service leadership people asked me, Rabbi, you chose to focus on memory and, pride. What about the negative side of pride, like the Bernie Madoffs and the others who we know in that? And my feeling was, we all know those things. We all know those things. What we forget are the things in our memories and the institutions and the foundations we're built off of, and I felt those were more important to hold. Meanwhile, still holding the pain of where we are in society, and not just our pain, but for me, it's the pains that are the brokenness in the world. I don't say, I'm very careful about the way I say broken. Wounded. I like wounded better than broken, because broken means it's really unable to be fixed. I believe that there are lots of things that are wounded and that we need to heal from. I have people online. Let me just get to some online. So I don't know if that answered a little bit, but maybe it touched on a little bit of what you were asking. So we have Joanne, Jeff, Maddie, and I know Talia and Richard all have their hands up. I'm going to go in that order and see what we can accomplish today. Okay, go ahead. Joanne, go ahead.
Okay, quick comment on something that surprised Herb and me recently. We met a friend of a friend who just casually threw off the term beaks. This was a term we had never heard before, and it of course referred to big noses and Jews. So I don't know if this is a question or a warning. This to me was so ingrained, systemic anti-Semitism in a casual throw-off remark. And of course, we came in and did a little education with him. Hello, we're Jewish, and and so forth. He continued to do it. What do we do about people like that? And do we go into the year ahead suspecting that everybody who is not Jewish, and maybe some who are, have that undercurrent of negativity and even more separation than we would normally have? And I'm going to mute myself.
So Joanne, thank you for that. Is there a specific question that you're asking in that?
Well, are there ways to handle that better than maybe we knew to do at the time? And do we go into interactions with new people hesitant about our Judaism? Not that I ever would be hesitant about my Judaism, but it makes me, it really gave us pause.
First of all, I think that the pause is really important, because I think when we send a response, an email or a post, and we just send it based upon how we're feeling in that moment, we don't have time to reflect. We don't have time to process, to really sit in that experience and to say, we're putting up that mirror. What is triggering about about what that individual said, what I'm experiencing in the world? Where is that? And to come from a place, I believe, rather of rahmanas, of compassion in that, and to have an understanding that person, it doesn't mean that we have to be, that we may have different opinions or different thoughts, but I think the approach is really important. How you communicate with people and how you have them understand how they feel seen and heard is really critical, because I learn every day from people that I have different interactions with and different experiences. And I don't like to make accusatory statements, nor am I ever going to deny or feel unproud of my Jewish identity for whatever reason at this point in my life. I think I've dared enough to earn those, that piece of life. I think for me, it's about how you approach an individual and how you help offer them perhaps a different lens or perspective.
Actually, share
That's
on
really
that.
important. Yeah, I know. You know this lady right here? Oh, I just wondered, okay.
And if I can, what I did with that experience was we went to have dinner with him and the people we were visiting. And I did show him that I was a human, and I did try and just be very respectful of him. And he was ultimately, at the end of the evening, able to be very appreciative that I was there and that I was able to, that I was Jewish.
Yeah.
So I was able to work through the experience, and I thought it was a win. And by the end of the evening, he was not saying all those derogatory terms about not only Jews, about every person, and I didn't even know that there were these names. He said, I come from Chicago and I have all these names, blah, 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 blah. But it's like, okay, I thought it was a win. I was able to just have him be more respectful and not throw around terms like that.
Very excellent, thank you. Thank you, Joanne, for the question. We have Jeff and then Maddie, and then Richard. Well, I'm working through the room here. I'm trying. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Rabbi?
Yes, I can. We can.
Okay. So I've been talking to some Jewish students at UCSD and about this. What we perceive in the country is that anti-Semitism, a lot of it's coming from the uptake of the white supremacists, but it's also coming from liberals, from California universities and such. It's not so much that they're anti-Semitic, from I'm hearing, is that they're anti-Israel. Now, I grew up as a baby boomer, the 6-Day War. Everyone knew that Israel was being attacked by the Arab neighbors and they were defending themselves. And they took that land not because they were oppressors, they were trying to defend themselves and keep them going forth. But the young people today, the Generation Z, they see Israel and Zionism as oppressive. They see them as keeping the Palestinians down, just like Iran keeps people down. And as such, they're turning on the Jews that go there and putting pressure on them and criticizing them. And it's a strong person that will stand up. An average person, when they're being oppressed, will loudly say, you know, I just rather not tell me when I'm Jewish, or maybe not be Jewish to avoid being oppressed. I just want to live my life. Don't let people attack me or criticize or whatever. So my question to you is, how can we identify more in the public this need, and why the school officials, the teachers, the presidents, the boards are not, when these are being brought out, they're not defending the Jews, only in extreme cases when it's so oppressive that they have to say it. Why can't the Jewish community put more emphasis on this issue?
I want to reframe it, if I can, a little bit, because the first thing is to note that there are generational divides, there's no question, but even within generations, intergenerationally, we have people on with very different understandings and experiences. My experience working in the West Bank and being on programs that work on Israel and Palestinian coexistence is not, for me, that's not the framework that I'm actually focused on hyper-locally, what we're talking about. Those issues are conflated. They are very much. And there are many issues with previous Israeli governments, and many issues that I personally take aim with. I was no fan of Netanyahu. I made that very publicly appealing on Habima. I've made that multiple times. I am very much someone who wants independence for Palestinian people. The idea around not being able for people to live in freedom and in justice with their own dignity is so antithetical to our concepts of Torah. It doesn't actually make sense to me how anybody could not be striving for that. The issue that we're dealing with here is how the issues around in the region conflate with the issues where anti-Semitic rhetoric becomes embedded in the language of anti-Israel. We have many Jewish individuals who are anti-Israel. That is every individual's choice, however they relate to Israel or not. My role in the world as a religious leader, and I also think as a Jewish leader, is to say, honor the voices of dissent, but also to know that there are critical issues that are going on day to day that we're dealing with on the front lines, that people are coming to me with, and others with, other of my colleagues, and coming to our local legislators with, and are dealing with this in their schools and in their neighborhoods and as such. And that becomes very challenging and to really raise awareness about, because people are very quick to deny another's experience. And what if we opened our ears a little more to heeding the experience? And again, potentially walking away to disagree, and to agree to disagree, but doing it in a way that we've heard each other and seen each other really, and still Jew to Jew, and non-Jew to non-Jew, and Jew to non-Jew, and however we want to break it up, that we can have respect and share that dignity for one another. Maddie, can we see your face? Possible.
Hi. Sorry, I'm at work right now.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I'm Maddie. I would like to say I'm 29 because we've talked about the young a little bit. So I am very Jewish. I'm very well educated. I grew up in this congregation, attending 3 times a week, teaching Hebrew school, singing in the choir, et cetera, et cetera. I really had an extremely hard time listening to the sermon. And the reason why is, you know, first of all, as a child growing up in synagogue, I was told that politics were not something we discussed in Hebrew school. And I remember when Prop 8 was just passed, no one at the synagogue would talk about Prop 8, publicly on the bema, because that was politics. But of course, Israel is in politics. I think the young generation is turning away from Judaism, not because we're misinformed, not because we don't like being Jewish, but because this rhetoric of fear, protectionism, and overstatement of harm that's coming from the generations. And I really see that in this sermon where we're focusing on anti-Semitism and, in a sense, really demonizing the left over anti-Semitism instead of focusing on people who are perhaps more harmed in the world right now, because there's a lot of them. I don't support Israel because when I look at Israel, there is not any values there that I support. Yes, there are Jews there. I support there being Jews in the world. But when I look at the politics of Israel or the ultra-religious in Israel, I do not support Israel. So it's very hard for me to continually be in these Jewish spaces where beyond even just talking about politics, that's fine. You're implicitly connecting what it means to be a good Jew is to support Israel. What it means to have a Jewish education is to go on birthright and support Israel. And I know you're all going to say we're misinformed. The young are misinformed about Israel. They don't know the issues. But the thing is, we are not misinformed. I think a lot of the young of us have done a lot of research and in some ways are coming from a more balanced viewpoint than a lot of the older generation who are more affected by, the trauma of the Holocaust and trying to understand their place in the world. So I'm not sure I really have a question. I guess if I had a question, it would be, do you think we could be Jewish without teaching Israeli identity as central to Jewish identity? But I guess my main message is I think we're really losing the young. I have no plans to be involved with the formal Jewish community as an adult because of this kind of rhetoric.
And Prop 8 was a ban on marriage equality in California, for those that are wondering. We passed
Prop 8 was a
it.
ban on marriage
We
equality,
banned
yes.
marriage equality at the ballot box here.
Yes. So, Maddie, thank you so much for that perspective and that honesty and that what you're saying is very critical to hear. And it is not in any way, I feel, a denial of your position. First of all, I do believe that you can sustain Jewish identity without teaching love of Israel. I think there are different pathways to an individual's identity. So I want to say that off right from the get-go. I don't believe that given the work in the world where I may not ally with you so much is in the talk of I think there's something that wasn't said in what you were saying, which is about what's going on hyper-local and what's going on the ground with individuals who have no connection to Israel but are still experiencing the effects of that. So that becomes people who may be Jewish by birth and have cultural identity at max and pop into a Seder every once in a while and and maybe light Hanukkah candles. But other than that, really don't have any Jewish identity. And yet they are feeling the effects of what happens when we start to, when the elevation of that rhetoric becomes more sustained and more mainstream. And so that's where I think where I was trying to focus us to really identify what the language is, not in terms of saying or demonizing anybody who is anti-Israel, because everybody has the right to critique, as our tradition mandates we do. And so I think that's really important. But I will continue to open dialogue and keep that going. These conversations don't rest in a sermon. They rest in our work and our footwork that we do to make this world more kinder and more whole. So we have a lot of work to do there. And this is going to be ongoing work that we're going to be doing throughout the year. And just like we started this work last year when I spoke of systemic racism and received a lot of flack for stepping up and speaking about things that are systemic in our world, we continued to involve 35 congregants for 7 months on learning how to be anti-racist and how to learn to do that work in the world of really identifying their own implicit bias. And this is work that we will continue to do. And we have to do that work inside the Jewish context as well in terms of identifying anti-Semitism. And I would actually honor voices like yours to continue that work with us so we can hold all of it together, because I don't think it's so intersectional and it's not myopic. There is too much nuance in our Jewish identities and lenses now to think it looks one way or the other. So I'm honored to be continuing in those conversations. Richard.
Hi, Rabbi, thank you for inviting me into the conversation. It pained me actually earlier to hear a colleague, a rabbi, speaking a question of education when I know that man has worked so hard to become educated, a rabbi. So that means there's been something that happened. And I just apologize, whoever didn't make for you the acknowledgement of how hard it is, the work you've done as a rabbi. What I want to say is I'm an educator. I've been an educator for 35 years. It's what I do. To me, the very being of who I am is through things like NIFTY and ADL. By my involvement in NIFTY, I was brought into a group of young people that were committed to learning. And that's where I think our youth want to be. The ADL supports by creating wonderful support. The Holocaust Museum is not just gone to by us Jewish people. It's gone to by everyone. Just as when I went to DC, I went to the African American Museum and I learned a lot. It's a museum that taught me about something that I needed to know, and I didn't know that I didn't know things. What I'm saying is education is fundamental, because when we have education, we're informed. It's not enough to just talk. We have to know what we're talking about. And if we're talking about anti-Semitism, we have to understand what it is before we go into a conversation, how other people view us. In addition to that, we have to also appreciate how other people have biases. We all have biases. I love the term unconscious bias because we don't know we have these biases. And ultimately, the question I'd like to ask, which I think Janice brought into the room, is how do we bring back the youth after 13? Because when we have minyan in the morning, they're not there. And that's the voice I'd love to have in the minyan. They're not at the Torah study. And when I go to Torah study, they're not there. So my question is, what is it going to take for us to recreate our Jewish community so we don't have a gap from 13 to 30 when they're showing up with their kids? Thank you, Rabbi.
It is a great question, Richard, and thank you. And I know that you're on the front lines working to educate our youth, so thank you. I don't have one answer for it. I think there's a process of how we look at engaging youth. I can tell you that the most success that I've had personally has been through immersive experiences. So, for example, when I do, and we will be going back to Latin America. We will be doing the work on the ground in Latin America and going into rural communities and seeing how 80% of the world lives. That work, in my anecdotal experience, and metric-wise also, is the most impactful Jewish identity experience that I have seen the children continue doing. How it continues is that they're not just active in the walls of a synagogue, but that they're actually utilizing those tools in their majors in college. They're creating their own groups in their universities and beyond. They're changing their professional pursuits to focus on international relations and how to heal the world a little bit at a time, but it all stems from what they're doing it all stems from what they start to learn about their own Jewish identity. So I think that has been one very successful model. I will tell you that the pandemic has had a significant impact on relational Judaism, period. No matter where you stand on any spectrum of identity, Jewish identity, it has. When you're not punim to punim, face to face with someone, it's well enough that everybody could be involved in a screen and we learn, and certainly Torah study has remained more than vibrant on the screen. There are still limitations to not being in the room with each other. And that experience has hindered also our ability to create immersive experiences. And so that has been one of our biggest losses this year. And now it was hard enough to start to engage the unengaged. But now we have to take about 5 steps back, because we are just starting to re-engage students who've lost 2 years of their identity. And I just bring to mind this. I was privileged to go to the FSU a couple of years ago I was invited on a mission from UJ New York. It was about 12 rabbis. And we went on this mission, it was about a 4-day mission, to see the FSU and to see what Federation, how they were investing in to try to re-emerge the Jewish community there. Jewish community was basically ostracized under Soviet rule. And many Jews who were labeled Jews were not practicing because they couldn't practice, they weren't allowed to. Now, in this time frame, Jews have become more engaged, but the generation that lost their identity because they couldn't practice it are now being educated by their children. And their parents, that lost generation, are starting to learn from the excitement that their children, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, are starting to have. That, to me, is one of the greatest ways we can influence Jewish identity, is by starting very young, like I said, and starting to impact them in terms of life cycle, in terms of milestone moments, in terms of feeling the joy of what it means. And taking that joy and amplifying it. And now we have parents here that come, I said, I've never stepped foot into a synagogue. My daughter's friend was at school, we were at school the other day and said they were learning Bim Bam. And all of a sudden it became something that my child had to learn. And then they wanted to come and they got involved and they got identified. And again, I think it's about sparking what speaks to people, but I would say immersive experiences has been one of the greatest rewards that I've experienced as a rabbi all these years, to really work with congregants to help them see outside of their bubbles that they live in. I know I'm going to get one more question, Tali, and then I'm going to go to the room. We are at 2:10. This is supposed to have 10 minutes ago, but I'm going to give it about 5 or 6 more minutes. I will stay for a little bit. And I know I don't want to overlap with contemporary confessions. It's really quite wonderful, so I really want everybody to have the opportunity to go, but I will stay a little longer. And then I'll stay behind if people want to ask questions and things like that. So go ahead, Tali.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for having this discussion. Honestly, when I heard the sermon, I was like, I had a ton of pride in the fact that you were courageous enough to speak about anti-Semitism. I'm also a young Jew. I'm 31 years old. I'm now the assistant director at the San Diego State Hillel. So I work in Jewish education, and I've been in informal Jewish education my entire career. And one of the things that I find with young people is this disillusion that they feel about Israel as they grow up, as they go off to college, as they become young adults, about what they hear about Israel in the news and what they learn, how they choose to learn about it, versus what they've been taught and told in Hebrew school and Sunday school. And then there's this like dissonance of like, by the way, sorry, I have a baby, so that's the voices in the background. But there's this dissonance. There's this dissonance between, you know, I face this too. What is like the Israel of my childhood, you know, and I used to visit Israel as a child because I have Israeli family, so I would visit Israel as like a child, and then as an adult and going on birthright, and then I went on subsequent trips to Israel, and then I actually lived in Israel for the past 6 years. I'm like only 1 month in San Diego, and what you see as the reality on the ground and the injustices that people face on the ground. And so I feel that a lot of young Jews, they, you know, and I think Maddie expressed this a little bit, like they find this dissonance as an adult, and then they don't know how to reconcile this like Israel or Jewish identity connected to Israel with their Jewish identity as an adult. And personally, I find that really like sad and like disheartening, because I think a lot of, you know, we're talking about anti-Semitism, And one of the things like that was like lightly alluded to is like, what about Jews who don't have pride in their Judaism? And some people associate that by being supporters of Israel, but some people just don't have pride in being Jewish because of the association that they create with Israel. And so it's something that like deeply affects me. And now that I work with college students and I see how they choose to identify as Jews, and some of them have been to Israel and what that Israel experience has meant to them and how it's, either made their Jewish identity stronger or, turned their Jewish identity kind of on its head because now they all have all of these questions. And I guess my question to you or just the people in the room is like, how can we create a Jewish identity that is based on common values and common morals and traditions? And nowadays there's just so much nuance that I feel that as Jews, as a global Jewish community, there's so much like infighting about, can we call out anti-Semitism or are we not allowed to call out anti-Semitism? How do we create a global Jewish community when we have such varying views about what it means to be Jewish, about how we identify with our Judaism, about how we feel about Israel? Sometimes it just feels like we're going in a direction of like complete dispersal within the Jewish community. I don't know if I'm making any sense. There's like a lot of thoughts in my head, but I hope it's somewhat clear.
That person is going to win the Nobel Prize. Because I'm going to get you in 1 second, I promise. I think that is an ideal, right? That I think we all hold, that we want to, that many of us hold, that we want, that, for me, I have, Ahavat Israel for a lot of reasons. I lived in Israel during the height of the Second Intifada. I was living there in Jerusalem when there were no other Americans around, when it was a very tough time. This is before any border walls or security fence or anything like that. This was before that time. This was a time where it went from relative peace to not. And it identified and shifted my own understanding of the region and what was going on there in very, very in profound ways. And I think that there is no one way to see this, but I think that we have to start to think about how we create different pathways of engagement for people who have different experiences. So for what Maddie was expressing, there's a huge importance for me to have that involvement with that voice, because I want that Judaism to sustain in the ways that it can. And it may not be exactly how I see it or view the world, but there's no reason why it can't coexist. And that, I think, is the biggest piece that we're wrestling with, is how to find that coexistence internally, where we weren't wrestling with that. That wasn't even the question. You know why? Because my generation was so apathetic to Jewish life that it really didn't matter to us so much. So you were Jewish. But and again, I know I'm giving a little more generalization. I don't think it's all exactly that way. I'm generalizing a little bit. I do believe a lot of the people that were my peers and contemporaries grew up with that, and are trying something different for their children, or are living in that PTSD of that experience and putting it on their children. So we're trying to undo that experience for them. But I agree with you that there has to be a way for us to allow the pathways to coexist. And I thank you for the work that you're doing you're at SDSU, you said, right? You're at Hillel, right? So thank you for continuing to inspire and do that work on the ground. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. We're live.
Okay. So I guess I want to reflect to the room that, this issue around generalizing and saying that, Jews are people who support Israel and conflating that is a huge issue. And whenever anybody says, well, the people who don't support Israel are not educated, that is a way of saying, you don't agree with me, and therefore you're not a real whatever, right? And so I just want to say, be careful about that reaction. It's one of the reasons why this idea that education doesn't work is a problem. I mean, no, It's one of the problems with the idea of education is going to be the key, because if you are assuming that everybody just needs the information that you have, and then they'll see it the way that you see it, you're missing the point. And I guess, to me, you started with this, Rabbi, you started with this idea of wrestling, right, and challenging authority. And that has always been the most precious part of Judaism for me, that I'm part of a community that respects this. I mean, in some ways it's academic, but in some ways it's not, right? That you can challenge and you have to wrestle. That's what you're supposed to do as a Jew. And if we can focus in on that, I think that's a place where we should be having conversations about whether or not, what is going on? How do we make sense of this stuff in Israel, right? We should be talking about that. We should not be creating spaces where everybody feels afraid to challenge, the Israeli government when, not every Jew, you've said it, right? Not every Jew believes that. But the problem, the whole root of this anti-Semitism is that people are assuming that if you're Jewish, you support everything that the Israeli government is doing. And that's not true.
Correct.
And we have to start from ourselves to break that down, because it's happening in this room.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. The divergent opinions are really critical here, right? What you're saying and how you just shared that lens is really critical. I think everybody's being really respectful, by the way. I think it's been a wonderful, rich conversation, actually. I'm very honored that it's been so rich. And I think that there are definitely different voices, and we even hear in the same generation, we hear different voices, right? So we know that. I think what we're living with what's on the ground today, right? So we have to work with what's on the ground today. And what we have today is we have the internal conflicts of understanding that Israel is not the end all and be all to Jewish identity, and it is not everybody's entry point. And I can tell you, working with many Jews by choice, working with those who converted, Israel is not part of many of their narratives. It has nothing to do with their narrative. They may explore and uncover it down the road, but in the moment of their journey, it's about Torah and text and the central values that come out of our identity that make up what this is about. And I think that how do we hold on to that and be in conversation with people who have different voices and respect that? And at the same time, remember, this is so nuanced and challenging. How do we deal with the real-time effects that this is having on the greater Jewish community? So we have real issues in anti-Semitism. I wasn't just hyperbole that I'm saying. It's real, factual, ADL metric, issues that we know times 100 that are going on. So we have to work on these issues that are not conflated, but rather that are divergent in our own circles, and also work to be as one, united against an affront that is becoming more nuanced and more pervasive in areas we've never experienced them before. And that, I think, is really the lens that I'm approaching it from. They're both critical and they're both necessary and important to work from. First, we have to identify what's on the ground, and then we can work from there. So, thank you. It's really, really cool.
Rabbi, should we close out the virtual room? Because I do know that
I think we should, yes. So again, this has been incredibly fascinating. And guess what? I'm not going anywhere. So you can reach me anytime you want, and really know that aside from tomorrow when I am taking off, well, I'm actually putting on my sentence. I don't know if it's a day off.
I'm a teacher, and he's had his hand up the whole time.
Go ahead. So we're gonna close out the virtual room, and then I said I would stay for a few minutes. So we're going to close. For those who are with us virtually, thank you. All of this session is recorded.
Yes, it'll be up on YouTube.
It'll be up on our YouTube page. And again, I welcome the conversation to continue. So thank you, Gemar Chatima Tova. Thank you so much.